Three love stories, each born from adventure, bound by obsession, and destroyed on the highest place on Earth. On Mount Everest, couples have promised each other the world, only to find that love means nothing when the air runs out. These three couples weren't reckless thrill seekers. They were partners, chasing something bigger than themselves. And for three of them, that chase ended in heartbreak, silence, and frostbite that froze their last words in time. This is the story of three couples who took their love to the roof of the world and never came back the same. Maria Stridham and Robert Gropel were a married couple from New Zealand who had built their lives around two things: teaching and travel. Maria lectured at Monash University in Melbourne. Robert was a veterinarian. Together they decided to climb the 7 summits, the tallest mountain on every continent. Everest was to be number 7, the one that would complete the list and prove they could do it without animal products or performance shortcuts. By May 2016, they were ready. They trained for months, passed medical checks, and joined a commercial expedition through 7 summit treks. Their climb began on the Nepal side during one of the busiest seasons on record. Weather windows were narrow, and dozens of climbers pushed toward the top at once. The crowds made everything slower, and every extra minute above 8,000 meters meant more danger. On May 20th, they left camp before dawn. The temperature was near 30 degrees, the wind moderate. For hours they moved steadily, resting only to change oxygen bottles. Around midday they reached the south summit, roughly 15 minutes below the true top. That was when Maria started to fade. Her pace dropped and she complained of dizziness. Robert noticed her eyes glazing over. She was still conscious but disoriented, unable to coordinate steps. It looked like high-altitude sickness, a warning that the brain was running out of oxygen. Robert radioed down, but traffic on the ridge meant help would be slow. Guides told them to decide quickly, turn back or continue. Maria wanted him to finish. She told him she'd wait. He hesitated, knowing the summit was close, but understanding how thin the margin for error was. After minutes of argument, he went on, promising to return immediately. Robert reached the top with other climbers. He spent less than 10 minutes there. The view meant nothing. When he started down, clouds were moving in and oxygen pressure was falling. He found Maria sitting in the snow, barely speaking. He gave her his spare oxygen mask and a dose of dexamethasone to fight swelling in her brain. For a moment, she improved. They began descending together toward the balcony. Not long after, she collapsed. Robert and 2 Sherpas tried to lift her, but she couldn't stand. They gave more oxygen, but her pulse weakened. At that altitude, rescue helicopters can't hover, and other climbers were already exhausted. The Sherpas pleaded to continue downward before nightfall. Robert stayed until she stopped responding. Then they lowered her body as far as they could before weather forced them to secure it and retreat. He made it back to camp before barely conscious, suffering fluid in his lungs. Other teams radioed for evacuation, and he was flown off the mountain days later. Maria's body was recovered the following week and sent home to her family. Her death raised questions that still surface each season: why climbers push beyond warning signs, how commercial expeditions handle overcrowding, and what it costs to reach a personal milestone at any price. For Robert, there were no answers, only the simple truth that a decision measured in minutes had taken everything. But Everest wasn't done taking. Another couple, climbing without oxygen, would soon prove that determination can be just as dangerous as hesitation. Francis and Sergey Arsentiev were an American-Russian couple who shared the same obsession, summiting Everest without bottled oxygen. It was 1998, and they wanted to prove that ordinary people could climb the highest mountain on Earth through patience and persistence, not fame or sponsorships. They had trained for years, climbing Denali, Elbrus, and other peaks, and now they were ready for the hardest one. They chose the north side route from Tibet, colder, harsher, and less commercial. Their goal was simple but risky: reach the summit, descend safely, and do it together without oxygen. The first 2 attempts failed. High winds and exhaustion forced them back. On the 3rd try, they left Camp 6 before midnight. By sunrise, they were moving slowly, but still advancing. Other climbers passed them, noticing how deliberate their steps were. They reached the summit late in the afternoon, too late for comfort. Sergey took photos while Frances leaned on her poles, drained but smiling. They had achieved what they came for, but the real danger was still ahead. Descending after sunset is nearly impossible above 8,000 meters. They bivouacked in the open, exposed to 40 degrees. By morning, both were frostbitten and oxygen deprived. When Sergey tried to guide Frances down the ridge, she stumbled and collapsed repeatedly. He had no spare oxygen, no strength to carry her. As he tried to stabilize her, other teams passed, unable to help without risking their own lives. Eventually, Sergey left her sheltered under a rock band to go for help. He carried extra oxygen bottles and ropes, promising to return. On the way down, he encountered a group of Uzbek climbers and begged them to assist. They tried but couldn't reach her through the worsening weather. Hours turned to a day. When Sergey climbed back up with supplies, he never returned. Later, searchers found his body lower on the slope, tangled in a fixed line, the oxygen bottle empty. Frances remained where he'd left her, alive but fading. The next morning, another team reached her position. Among them were Kathy O'Dowd and Ian Woodall, who had summited hours earlier. They found Frances conscious but barely breathing, murmuring for her husband. They gave her oxygen and tried to lift her, but she was too weak to move. After nearly an hour, they were forced to make a choice: stay and die, or descend and live. They left her there, marking the coordinates for recovery. Frances died shortly after. Her body stayed visible near the route for years, preserved by the cold and wind. Climbers nicknamed her Sleeping Beauty, though Sergey's story made that name hollow. In 2007, Woodall returned privately to move her remains out of sight and cover them with an American flag. He said it wasn't about closure, it was about respect. Their climb became a cautionary tale. The summit means nothing if you can't descend. Yet, even knowing that, couples keep trying. And 8 years later, another one believed they'd learned from stories like this. They hadn't. Rob Hall wasn't just another climber. He was one of the world's top Everest guides, the man who helped hundreds of people reach the summit safely. Together with his wife, Jan Arnold, he had built a respected mountaineering company called Adventure Consultants. They climbed together often, and in 1993 they summited Everest as a team. 3 years later, in 1996, Rob returned to lead another commercial expedition. John stayed home in New Zealand because she was pregnant with their first child. By May 10th, the climb had gone smoothly. The team included experienced mountaineers and clients who had trained for years. But that morning, delays on the Hillary Step and slow progress up the fixed ropes put everyone behind schedule. A storm was forming, and the rule was clear. Anyone not on the summit by 2 p.m. had to turn back. Rob had made that rule himself. He also broke it that day. Around 4 p.m., several climbers, including Rob and one of his clients, Doug Hansen, were still pushing upward. They reached the summit hours late, just as the weather collapsed. Whiteout conditions hit the ridge, and the temperature dropped below 40 degrees. Hansen collapsed on the descent. Rob stayed with him, refusing to leave his client behind. Through the night, radio contact continued. Base camp urged him to descend, but Rob reported that Hansen was unresponsive and that his own oxygen supply was almost gone. When rescuers tried to reach him the next morning, they couldn't climb through the storm. He was stranded near the south summit, around 8,700 meters high, too far for anyone to reach in time. That evening, Rob managed to make one last satellite call. It was patched through to New Zealand, where Jan answered. They spoke briefly. She told him how proud she was of him, and he told her to sleep well and not worry. Then the line went silent. Those were his final words. Rob's body was found days later, still clipped to the rope, sitting upright in the snow. The radio beside him was frozen solid. Jan gave birth to their daughter months later. She named her Sarah, after the mountain wind Rob used to talk about. The 1996 Everest disaster became one of the most studied events in mountaineering history. 8 climbers died that day, and Rob's decision to stay with his client was both condemned and admired. For many, it symbolized loyalty taken to its extreme. A man who couldn't separate duty from compassion, even when it cost him his life. For Jan, it was more personal. She had shared that same summit with him just 3 years earlier, standing where he took his final steps. In interviews later, she said she never blamed the mountain. She understood why he stayed. That was who he was. Each of these couples reached Everest believing love could survive anything. Every one of them faced the same truth. At extreme altitude, love doesn't protect you. It tests you. It forces choices no one should have to make. Who climbs higher, who turns back, and who lives with what's left. Every season, new climbers arrive believing they'll be different. They promise they've learned from the past. Then the wind shifts, the air thins, and the same story starts again. Another couple, another promise, another ending written in snow. So, what do you think? Is love on Everest an act of courage, or the most dangerous mistake a person can make?